Between the byres and the hill, Pride met a staff cut from hazel wood. Kicked by sleet, Davy Kerr slammed the byre gate and ran into the yard. Wet wool and cold peat smoke clung to the air. 3 ewes had broken the hurdle in the night, and 1 lamb lay stiff beside the water trough. Across the lane, old Elspeth Yarrow stood with her hazel staff planted in the mud, watching the clouds slide low over Cademuir Hill. "You drove them too high after Candlemas," she called. Her voice carried clear through the bleating and the rattle of loose tin. "The hill gave you 1 warm week. You took it for a promise." Davy caught the surviving lamb and shoved it back under its dam. His fingers burned from the cold. He was 20, broad in the shoulder, quick with cattle, and proud of being quicker than men twice his age. He looked at Elspeth's worn shawl, her boots caked with black peat, and the polished hazel stick she used like a magistrate's rod. "A promise," he said. "It was grass, not prophecy." Elspeth tapped the yard stone once with her staff. "Grass can lie in March. Heather does not, nor curlew, nor crow, nor the smell of the moss when frost still sits under it." Davy laughed, loud enough for Tam Laidlaw at the next byre to hear. Tam glanced away at once, as if laughter near Elspeth had weight. In the border country people brought her sick calves, asked her when to cut peat, and watched her face before they cast seed. Davy called it old muttering fit for winter firesides. That same week warm wind softened the braes, and green blades flashed over the lower fields. Davy pushed his sheep upward before any other drover moved. He boasted at market that he would sell fat lambs while his neighbors still counted feed sacks. Men shook their heads, but no one argued. The wind smelled sweet. The burns ran loose. Even the hill looked kind. Then the sky turned white and hard. Snow came from the east in a long dry sheet that rasped over stone and flattened the new grass under ice. For 2 days the valley heard nothing but shutters banging and beasts crying for fodder. When the storm broke, 6 of Davy's sheep were gone from the upper slope, and the rest nosed at blighted turf as if the earth had forgotten them. He searched till dusk. He found hoof marks, a torn tuft of fleece on gorse, and no more. At the edge of the moor Elspeth waited beside the old drove path, her hazel staff dark with thaw. "If you want the sheep," she said, "come at first light. Keep your mouth shut, and follow where the hill still remembers. The track above line water." Davy met Elspeth before dawn where the drove road left the last cottages. The air smelled of wet heather and old snow. She gave him no greeting, only started uphill with her staff striking stone, then turf, then stone again in a measured beat. Under the green skin of spring, the hill still held winter in its fist. He carried a coil of rope, a crook, and a sack with ode bannock wrapped in cloth. He had expected her to lead him straight to a hidden fold or a gully where sheep had drifted. Instead she stopped at the first shoulder of ground and pointed not ahead, but back. "Look," she said. The valley lay under a thin veil of mist. Peebles sat quiet beyond the river, its roofs pale under the morning. Nearer at hand the fields showed their hurt plainly. Lower meadows glimmered green in patches, yet the high braes looked singed, as if a hot iron had passed over them. Davy saw bare scars where sheep had bitten too early and found the roots black beneath. "I know what blight looks like," he said. Elspeth shook her head. "No, you know what loss looks like after it has eaten. I asked you to look before." She knelt and pressed her palm to the earth where frost still held under the surface. Davy copied her because he had no answer ready. Cold climbed into his skin at once. Above the thawed top, the ground had seemed soft. Underneath, it was iron. "False spring," she said. "The hill lets out a sweet smell. Men trust it, sheep trust it, then the old cold rises from below and bites the root. The grass shines first, then dies. Your eye saw color. Your hand did not test the earth." Davy drew back and wiped his fingers on his kilt hose. He wanted to say that no man could feed stock on caution alone. Yet below them he could see Tam Laidlaw's flock still penned near the steading, hay set out in neat dark rows. Tam had listened. Davy had laughed. They climbed farther. At a gate fallen from one hinge, Elspeth paused beside a stone set upright in the bank. Wind hummed through bent rushes. She touched the stone with the staff and watched the line of crows lifting from the far side of the hill. "My mother stood here in the hunger spring of 17, she said. She had 2 sons and 4 milk cows then. She said the crows flew low 3 days before the wet snow came, and the peat water fell silent as a shut mouth. She sold a silver brooch to buy oatmeal. The brooch fed 6 hearts till May. That is what weather lore means. Not charms. Bread." The word struck harder than rebuke. Davy looked at her hands, red and cracked around the polished staff. He had heard stories of old lean years, but they had always sounded distant, boxed away with old coins and graves on kirkyard slopes. Here, on the cold ground, hunger stood close enough to touch. He thought of his own mother counting turnips by lantern light the night after the storm. She had hidden the smallest pile with an empty basket, though he had seen it. She did not want his little sisters to know how near the feed bin stood to bare wood. Elspeth moved on without waiting. By noon they reached a bend where the path narrowed between broom and rock. There she crouched and lifted a shred of fleece from a thorn. Davy's breath caught. "Mine," he said. "Aye." She studied the snag, then the slope beyond. Not fox work, too high for a drag, too clean for panic. They drifted in the white and kept moving. Sheep seek the lee side when the hill turns its face. So do men, though men pretend otherwise. She pointed her staff toward a fold of land hidden from the valley below. "Your flock is not the only thing missing. Open your ears as well as your eyes. The hill has been speaking since February." Where the crows bent west, they crossed into rougher ground where heather brushed their knees and old peat cuts opened like dark mouths in the slope. The wind carried the bitter smell of bog water. Davy kept close now, not from trust, but because the moor hid its dangers under harmless color. The birds left first, and at last Davy understood that leaving could be warning. Elspeth stopped again where 3 bent rowans clung to a shelf of rock. From there the land fell away toward a strip of black moss and, beyond it, a run of higher ridges. Crows wheeled over the moss, then all at once swung west in one dark turn. "Rain before night," Davy said, pleased to know one answer. "Not enough," Elspeth replied. "Watch the height, watch the haste. They are leaving ground that will not hold a foot by dusk." She stepped down and tested the path with her staff before each pace. Davy followed, his boots sinking at the edges. Twice he nearly slipped into water hidden by sedge. Each time Elspeth caught his sleeve with a grip that shamed him. At the moss edge she pointed to a line of prints, half filled with brown water. Sheep, then a dog's lighter mark, then none. Davy frowned. "I brought no dog that day." "No," she said. "Jock Muir's collie passed here yesterday. He lost 4 ewes too. You thought ruin had singled you out because your pride stands in the middle of your own head. But look there." From that shelf he could see farther farms than he knew by name. Some yards showed hayricks cut low. One had an empty byre door swinging loose. Another held a cart beside a stack of peat, with no horse hitched to it. The valley had not cried out, it had tightened in silence, each house making do until there was little left to do with. In market talk, men argued over wool prices and lamb weights. On the hill, none of that mattered. A child still needed porridge whether sheep fetched a good sum or not. A cow still needed dry bedding whether the laird praised thrift or cursed waste. Davy felt his face grow hot despite the wind. Elspeth took the bannock from his sack and broke it in 2. She handed him the larger piece. He looked up, surprised. "Eat," she said, "an empty belly hears only itself." They sat on a flat stone, chewing in the wind. Davy noticed how she saved every crumb from her lap and pressed them into her palm. Not one fell to the moss. He remembered mocking her at last autumn's fair when she had told a boy not to whistle over a pail of milk because breath cooled the cream. It had seemed a small foolishness. Now he wondered how many small careful acts kept a hard season from turning cruel. When they rose, Elspeth lifted her hazel staff and held it out to him. "You carry it from here." Davy took it with both hands. The wood felt warm where her grip had been, smooth from years of use. Hazel grew in sheltered places along burns and hedges, not on the open height. Someone had cut this branch with choice, trimmed it, dried it, and trusted it over long winters. "Why me?" he asked. "Because a staff is not for leaning only," she said. "It measures ground. It warns before the boot learns. It asks a man to slow his own step. You have spent a season hurrying. Now you will go at the pace that keeps beasts alive." With the staff in hand he moved differently. He probed hummocks before shifting weight. He listened for the hollow sound under peat crust. He watched the crows. Once he caught the faint tinny clink of a bell far off, so thin he first took it for fancy. He raised a hand. Elspeth froze. Both stood still until the wind dropped. There it came again, a sheep bell, 1 note, then 2. Davy turned toward the sound, heart hammering. Elspeth did not praise him. She only nodded once and pointed the way with her chin. "Now the hill answers," she said. The silence of the black peat. The bell led them into a fold between 2 ridges where the wind dropped without warning. In that stillness Davy heard another sound. Water moving underground, not over it, a muffled gulp beneath the peat. The place smelled rich and sour, like cut turf left in rain. The hill yielded the sheep only to patience, caution, and cold hands in the mire. Elspeth touched his arm and pointed ahead. A patch of green lay smoother than the rest, bright as summer cloth. Davy would have stepped straight onto it 3 days earlier. Now he set the hazel staff down first. It sank deep at once. Bog skin, Elspeth said. Pretty and hungry. He swallowed. Beyond the green patch, in the shelter of a low bank, he saw a wool moving. 3 ewes stood packed together, mud up to their hocks. A 4th lay trapped on one side where the ground had given under her front legs. The bell came from her neck. Davy lunged forward, but Elspeth caught the back of his coat. Not there. The bank first. Round by the stones. He obeyed because the staff, the crows, the frozen root, all of it had broken something stubborn in him. They moved wide, stepping from rock to tuft, then down the firmer edge of the hollow. Up close the trapped ewe trembled so hard her bell shook in broken notes. Foam flecked her muzzle, her eyes rolled white. Easy, lass, Davy whispered. He had spoken like that to lambs before, though never with anyone listening. He slid on his belly across the bank while Elspeth braced him by the ankles. Peat water soaked through his sleeves with a cold that cut to the bone. He worked the crook under the ewe's chest and drew her inch by inch while Elspeth drove the hazel staff sideways into the mud to break the skin around the animal's legs. The ewe came free with a hard sucking sound. Davy dragged her to turf and lay gasping beside her, cheek against heather. It smelled sharp and clean after the bog. Elspeth rubbed the animal down with handfuls of dry rushes from her sack until the shivering eased. 2 more sheep bore his mark. The 3rd belonged to Jock Muir, as Elspeth had guessed. They found another farther in, dead already, half covered by blown sedge. Davy removed his cap and stood silent. Elspeth bowed her head for one plain moment, then covered the carcass with heather to keep carrion off until it could be fetched. Grief on a hill was practical. There was no room for show. Yet the weight of that stillness pressed on Davy more than weeping would have done. He thought of Jock counting in the dark, stopping at a number that would not rise. He thought of children asking whether the lost ewe had been found. The moor kept such questions without answer unless someone walked out to meet them. Rain began at last, fine and slanting. They could not drive the sheep back across the bog in that weather. Elspeth led them instead to a ruin of old shepherd walls tucked under the ridge. There they penned the animals with hurdles of loose stone and covered the weakest with plaid cloth from Davy's sack. While they worked, Davy said, I called you names at market. Elspeth kept stacking stones. I said men listened to you because they feared old wives' noise. He said another stone, fitting it carefully into the gap. Rain ticked on the wall top. I was wrong. That made her stop. She looked at him as if measuring not his words, but the labor inside them. Good, she said. Wrong spoken early can still feed stock. Wrong carried into pride starves a parish. They spent the night in the shelter, taking turns to wake and check the sheep. Davy did not sleep much. Once, near midnight, he heard the peat under the hill give a deep slow sigh as water shifted in hidden channels. He understood then what Elspeth had meant by silence. The moor was never empty. It spoke in signs too plain for a proud man to notice. The wind read plainly. By morning the rain had cleared the air. The ridges stood sharp, and each stone cast a clean shadow. Davy rose stiff and mud-stained, but the sheep had strength enough to walk. He used the hazel staff without thinking now, tapping ahead, choosing the firmer line, pausing when the ground changed smell from wet grass to sour moss. He came down the hill with sheep, with silence, and with a different pair of eyes. They brought the animals down by a longer route that skirted the dangerous hollow. On the way Elspeth halted at places he would once have crossed without a glance. Here she showed him how bent heather on one side meant the hard wind usually came from another quarter than the valley guessed. There she pointed to ants building high around their hillocks before a wet week. At a burn she had him taste the water where peat stain thinned. If it runs clear after long rain, she said, the upper ground has held. If it darkens all at once, the hill is loosening. Davy tried each sign and fixed it in his mind by touch and smell, not by phrase. He snapped a dead stem and heard the damp inside. He watched swallows cut low over a field where gnats had risen ahead of a warm front. He knelt where rush roots soured in cold trapped soil. Knowledge came to him not as charm or mystery, but as labor paid to the world through attention. At the lower gate they met Jock Muir and Tam Laidlaw coming up with a sled and feed sacks. Jock saw his ewe first and gave a hard breath that bent him at the waist. He pressed his hand over his eyes, then took the rope Davy offered. Found her in the black moss, Davy said. One was lost there. I covered it from the birds. Jock nodded, unable to speak for a moment. At last he said, You walked far for another man's beast. Davy glanced at Elspeth. I should have walked earlier for my own. News moved through the valley before noon. Not loud, not in any grand way. A woman at the well heard from Tam. A boy carrying Pete heard from her. By evening 3 men had gone to mend a broken boundary on the high ground, and 2 families pooled fodder until the next market day. No bell rang for this change. No one made a speech. People simply began to look up when Elspeth lifted her staff and named what the hill was saying. Davy came to her cottage a week later with a new iron ferrule for the end of the hazel stick. He had shaped it himself at the smithy fire under Mungo's eye. The old one had worn thin from years on stone. Elspeth turned the staff in her hand and tested the fitted metal against her palm. Smoke from her peat hearth scented the low room. Bundles of dried yarrow and mint hung above the lintel, not for wonder, but for cough, cut, and tea. Payment, she asked. Davy shook his head. Repair, and a request. She waited. When you go up Cademuir again, he said, take me with you. I can carry the sack, and I can keep quiet longer than before. At that, one corner of her mouth moved. Not a full smile. Enough. She set the ferruled tip on the flagstone floor, and the note it made was firm as a nail driven home. Through lambing season Davy changed his ways in small visible acts. He tested the earth under fresh green before moving stock. He watched bird flight at dusk. He left a strip of lower pasture untouched against late cold. When boys mocked him for standing still to smell the wind, he let them. Men who had laughed once began to ask, casual as if it meant nothing, whether the upper brae was safe after soft rain. Summer came at last, honest and steady. Heather purpled on the slopes. Bells sounded from sound ground, and the valley answered with work instead of worry. Sometimes, from the market road, people saw Davy Kerr and Elspeth Yarrow on Cademuir Hill, small against the wide sky, one carrying the sack and the other the hazel staff until the path turned rough, when she would hand it over and let him read the land before her.